Can anybody tell me what this word means? Iatrophobia. Does anybody know what that is? No, kind of the opposite of that. Iatrophobia is the fear of doctors. And I found an article about it on clevelandclinic.org, which defines the term and goes on to say, to answer the question, what are the complications of iatrophobia? Skipping medical exams and tests puts you at risk for serious, often irreversible disease complications that can affect your quality of life and longevity. For instance, undiagnosed, untreated high blood pressure and high cholesterol increase your risk for a potentially fatal stroke or heart attack. Regularly seeing your doctor is critical to good health. So, with that being said, so I am teaching on a psalm tonight, and but the message I have for you, I do have a message. It's kind of backwards. I'm not going to actually read you the psalm until a little bit later. What I want to do here is I want to set up the psalm, not in terms of like the context or the historical background of it, but more the heart of the psalm. What's the kind of the purpose behind it. And so I'm going to again switch gears. This will all come together, I promise. To the title of my message, which is the most important thought. Now, here's your second question for the night. Does anybody know who Daniel Webster is? A couple of people. Somebody tell me who Daniel Webster is. Okay. So he's a well-quoted man, and here's one of his quotes that I like best. Mind is the great lever of all things. Human thought is the process by which human ends are ultimately answered. Mind is the great lever of all things. Human thought is the process by which human ends are ultimately answered. Which is basically saying that the mind, the way that you're thinking, your thought processes, are what ultimately determines your end, right? Where you end up in life. Another quote of his, this was in an interview. He said, he was asked what's the most important thought that has ever occupied your mind? And his answer was, the most important thought that ever occupied my mind is that of my individual responsibility to God. So any of you who are well-read and or are believers, that might remind you of another quote. Does that remind anybody of another well-known quote? I'll say it. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. That's a pretty well-known quote. Can anybody tell me whose quote that is? What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. That's a quote by A.W. Tozer in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy. And C.S. Lewis, another respected theologian, he had kind of a different take on that quote. He says, by God himself, it is not, meaning the most important thing is not what comes into our minds when we think about God. Rather, how God thinks of us is not only more important, but infinitely more important. Indeed, how we think of him is of no importance except insofar as it is related to how he thinks of us. And so these two thoughts are kind of two sides of the same coin. But I partly disagree with Lewis. God's love, of course, is important. It's the most important. It's his most emphasized attribute in the Bible. But at the same time, God's love, without our response to it, is not going to prevent us from jumping into hell if that's what we choose. I'm going to read this. This is a small portion of a sermon given by Reverend W.S. Patterson. This was the sermon. He was a reverend in West Virginia. The sermon was given December 11th, 1909. He says, Calvary, with Christ hanging there upon the cross, shows more than love. It shows the justice of God. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The wages of sin is death. Are you a sinner? Is your soul dead? Have you been given the wages of sin? No. Christ paid it for you. Yet Christ was an innocent being and suffered all this for your sin. The debt had to be paid. If God demanded of his innocent son that he pay the debt and you go before God presuming upon his love to let you off without payment, what do you suppose would be his answer to you? So we have the idea of justice, right? And because of the justice of God. Imagine that. Imagine walking up to the gates of heaven, knocking on the door, saying, listen, God, everybody says that you're loving. Yeah, I sinned, I did some things, but let's just, let bygones be bygones and just let me into heaven. For God to accept that, to just let you off with no punishment whatsoever, would be unjust when he killed his innocent son to pay the price for you. So his justice must be satisfied. And for that reason, I disagree with Lewis. But again, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. Ultimately, all three of these quotes regarding the most important thing, the most important thought, we're all agreeing that the most important aspect of life is our relationship to God, regardless of what side you come at it from. And so, with that in mind, the most important aspect of life is our relationship to God. I want to ask the question, what is the most important aspect of your relationship with God? And I'm going to break that question down even further into two questions. What is our most important responsibility towards God? And then on his end, what is God's most important responsibility to us? And it might sound almost blasphemous to phrase the question in that way, what is God's most important responsibility to us, as though he owes us anything. But I'm going to argue that he does have a responsibility to us, in as much as he has humbled himself into a place where he is committed to us in certain ways. So why do these questions matter? Why does it matter what God's most important responsibility to us is, or what ours is to him? Well, it matters for the same reason that learning anything about your spouse, for example, matters. In any relationship, you need to know what the other person, what their expectations are, they should know what your expectations are of them. And answering these questions will help us focus on what's important in our relationship with God, and also just quite simply answer that question, what does God require from us? So here's your, no, we're not quite there yet. So what does God require from you? You could say righteousness, right? He gave us the 10 Commandments and hundreds of other commandments in the Bible. Is that what he requires from us? Is it perfection, as we read in Matthew 5, verse 48, where Jesus says, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect? So is that the bar that we're reaching for? Or perhaps Micah 6:8, where we're told very clearly and plainly, he has told you, man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Or is it going to church every week? Is that what is required of us? So, before we answer that question, here's where I'm going to open up to your fourth question. What would you say is God's most important quality? Of all the qualities that he has, would it be his love, his holiness, his righteousness? What is God's most significant, most important quality? Any guesses? Any takers? Sorry? Grace? Any others? Anybody else? Holiness? So all these things are important, but I'm going to make the point that what is most important, first and foremost, about God is his integrity, his honesty. Because without his honesty, we can't take anything else at face value. If he lied to us even once, then we can't trust anything that he's told us about himself. And so how do we know that he is graceful or merciful or righteous or holy? If he's lied even one time, then all bets are off. And most importantly, perhaps, we couldn't trust that he would do what he has promised to do. In Deuteronomy, when God is addressing his people, he gives us some guidance on what prophecy looks like. He says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. So if you're a prophet of God, if you're speaking on God's behalf, you got to be 100% accurate all of the time. There's no room for error. The punishment is death otherwise. Compare that standard to people who proclaim themselves to be psychics in today's world. For sake of time, I won't go into detail, but I can assure you there are none of them that are 100% accurate. And so in God's economy, dead, that's it. Why should we listen to you? Why trust somebody with an 80%, 90%, even 99% success rate of telling the truth, of accurately predicting the future? If we hang out 10 times and every time we get in the car together, I say, listen, I'm probably not going to punch you in the face. There's like a 90% chance that I'm going to. And if we hang out 10 times and I punch you once, like, is that good enough for you, that 90% chance that I might not punch you in the face? Why trust somebody who's not completely infallible? And if God, like I said, if he lied even one time, then all bets are off. And that doesn't just include telling us things that are false, but that means if he failed to fulfill a prophecy once or a promise one time, any of that, then he couldn't be trusted in any way. And I've always thought it interesting, how could a God who literally speaks things into existence lie? Like if he points and says, hey, there's a tree over there, now there's a tree. Like he can't lie, right? So this could be a whole message in and of itself. But you may ask, what about contradictions in the Bible, right? People say that there are a lot of contradictions, different passages that contradict one another. And without going too deep into that, like I said, it could be another message in and of itself. But there's a difference when we believe that the Word of God is inspired by God. But that's different than saying that it was dictated by God. God didn't micromanage the Bible, telling Paul or Moses exactly every single word to say. He gave them some freedom to be themselves. We see different styles of writing, different traits of personality coming out in the different writers from different areas of Scripture. So the Word, while it is true and it was inspired, that's different than saying that it was dictated. You also have to remember that no translation into the English language is perfect. There are always going to be little differences here and there. Context is important. So again, that's a whole study in and of itself. But you have to take into account these nuances when you're studying the Bible. But why? Why is the Bible that way? Why would why would he leave any room for doubt, right? You would think that he would almost dictate it to make sure that it's absolutely perfect, that there's no room to question it. And I think the answer to that question is because he does want you to question it. He wants you to study the Bible for yourself. He wants you to delve in, to dig in, to learn the context, to compare it to itself, to the other books within it. We're told to study the Word for ourselves and to question it. If you never question what you believe, if you simply repeat things that you've been told, then do you really believe them? And that's the beauty of God's perfect honesty, because he not only is he not afraid for us to ask questions, but he encourages us to do so. There are a lot of faiths and denominations that discourage reading the Bible. They don't want people to figure out too much. Or those psychics again, right? If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm a psychic and your dead grandfather has this message for you, there's no way for you to verify that. You can't, okay, let me go call my dead grandfather myself and ask him. You just have to take their word for it, right? There's no way for you to verify. But the perfect honesty of God, it invites us to ask questions. And that, in turn, invites honesty from us, which answers our second question, right? That was our first question. What is God's most important responsibility towards us? Which, I believe is first and foremost his honesty, so that we know everything else is true. And to the second question, what is our most important responsibility towards God? I believe it's the same answer. I believe it's honesty. The honesty that it takes to ask the tough questions of God, to truly express ourselves to God in all the ugliness of our emotions, all of our doubts. God's not scared of your questions. He's not intimidated by those doubts. One of my favorite people in the New Testament is this father. In Mark 9, he brings his possessed son to Jesus. I'm going to read from verse 20. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." He was honest about his doubts, and he expressed those doubts to Jesus. And Jesus didn't say, "Well, that's not good enough. Talk to me a week from now, and maybe we'll see what we can do." No, Jesus drove the demon out of his boy. He healed him. So do you not have enough faith? Tell him. Ask for more faith. Do you not have enough wisdom? Tell him. Ask for more wisdom. He invites these sort of questions and the honesty that is inherent within them. The mutual honesty on both of our ends, ours and God, means that no problem is off the table. There's nothing that you cannot bring to him. No sin, no weakness, nothing whatsoever. Helplessness and honesty about your helplessness are really truly the only things that we have to bring to him anyway. And that's really, when it boils down to it, all that he requires of us. And I put to you that God is more honored by somebody who, expressing their true raw emotion, cries out saying, "God, I hate you," than by a self-righteous person claiming to love God and yet spitting in his face the next moment. I mean, think of the Pharisees in the New Testament. Jesus was a friend of sinners, but it was the Pharisees that he had to constantly rebuke because they were the ones who were not honest with him. Honesty with God is easy, right? Praying is easy. You just have to tell him what's on your mind. I mean, it would be stupid to lie to a doctor, right? But that's not usually how cases of iatrophobia go. So in the field of psychology, there's a concept called cognitive dissonance, which means that when it basically boils down to this: your brain does not like internal conflict. Any kind of internal conflict just has to be resolved, otherwise it's going to boil up into things like anxiety and depression. But the concept of cognitive dissonance means that when confronted by a truth that threatens your security, you have two choices, because you have to reconcile this difference, right? You can either change your view or you can try to change the truth. So in the case of iatrophobia, fear of the doctor, let's say that I have a pain in my liver. Pain is telling me I have to go to the doctor. My fear says I can't go to the doctor. So now I have this internal conflict with only two possible resolutions. Either one, I push through my fear and just go to the doctor anyway, or two, I push away the pain and try to convince myself that it's not that big of a deal. And so that's where being dishonest to the doctor, or to carry the analogy, being dishonest towards God, that's where it's really rooted, right? First, before you can do that, you have to be dishonest with yourself. Lying to yourself is the most dangerous spiritual disease, because how can you help somebody that doesn't know that they have a problem? So, with all that being said, like I said, I'm trying to set up the psalm, and we're almost out of time here. I'm going to read the psalm now. So this is Psalm 10. I wanted to set that up. I wanted to give you that idea of just raw honesty towards God. And then I'm going to read this psalm. I want you to have that in mind. I don't want you to think about, whoa, what was the context of this? What is this specific writer thinking about? I want you to put yourself in the shoes. Rich was reminded me earlier this evening that these psalms, they were used in corporate worship, right? And so this was meant to be brought into any gathering of believers and applied, almost used to express yourself to God. And so I want you to put yourself into that kind of mindset and just look at the honesty that's being expressed here. This psalm is a lament. This is the psalmist just crying out to God, and in ways that seem to be almost disrespectful at times. Like this first verse: "Why, Lord, do do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Obviously, God's not actually hiding. This is it almost seems offensive to God. He's accusing God of hiding his face when he needs him most. So I want you to just bear all this in mind and just look at the emotion of this, the raw expression to God. And I'm going to read the whole psalm. Psalm 10. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes he devises. He boasts about the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. Your laws are rejected by him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will ever shake me. He swears, no one will ever do me harm. His mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush, he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. Like a lion in cover, he lies in wait. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed. They collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God will never notice. He covers his face and never sees. Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked man. Call the evildoer to account for his wickedness that would not otherwise be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land. You, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror. It's the pure, completely honest cry of a frustrated heart. And I want you to think, if you were to sit down and write a psalm or a song of lament, just truly expressing your rawest of emotions, not afraid to offend God as though he doesn't already know what's in your heart, what would that look like? Have you ever done that? Have you ever expressed yourself to God that boldly? And I find that there are two ways that we can do that. We can be honest with God. One, obviously, is to pray. Just tell God what's on your mind. But the second one is honesty, opening up to your fellow believers, right? God's representatives. Because by interacting with one another in community, that's one of the big ways in which we hear God, right? As we're reminded by others of God's word and of his love. God is in the business of changing hearts, and so why do we hesitate to bring him our hearts exactly as they are? It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. I always think of the woman in the New Testament who's depicted being caught in the act of adultery by the Pharisees, and she's about to be stoned to death. And I mean, have you ever just been in the midst of like at the moment committing sin, doing something that you know is wrong, and you think like, man, I hope Jesus doesn't come back right now because I'm going to be in trouble. So put yourself in the shoes of this poor woman she was caught in the act of adultery, which back then carried the death penalty. She gets caught. That's pretty bad, right? She's gonna. I mean, her life is over. And then to make matters worse, God walks in. God's the one who gave us this law: do not commit adultery in the first place. He's the one who gave us the penalty of death for this sin. So I mean, things can't get any worse, right? And yet, Jesus walking in at her lowest, most depraved, most shameful moment was actually the best thing that happened to her as she was forgiven. And he says, go and sin no more. And so, I mean, and that's the Jesus we deal with, right? Don't again, as though he doesn't know what's in our hearts, don't shy away from expressing yourself to him fully.